Okay, everybody, we're in the final sprint here. So if I can ask you all to come back to the tables, please. Ideally to a different table. And try to get this last segment in for the day. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Stephen Zoff. Stephen is an MIT grad, PhD, MIT PhD, ran the Stanford Center for Automotive Research for a number of years, has done quite a bit of interesting work on ride-hail and all sorts of topics. He is head of policy at Ellis and Associates, and we're very proud to count him as a fellow of the MIT Mobility Initiative. Stephen is going to give us a debrief on the Mobility Equity Symposium, which took place last year. Thanks, Stephen.
Hi, everybody. I appreciate that you're all staying late today. And so we're going to keep these remarks pretty tight. As John mentioned, there was a mobility symposium that was held last summer, a mobility equity symposium last summer. And what I wanted to do was do a very quick readback from that mobility equity symposium, and then also offer some thoughts as we think forward to the role of MMI today and in the future. So this past June, it was the MIT Mobility Initiative in partner with the Barr Foundation, the Sasaki Foundation, hosted this symposium with the objective of really understanding mobility equity issues in our own backyard. So we've talked a lot today about issues, taking issues at a very broad level, looking at a very high level, but this was very much in June a deep dive into two specific communities. In fact, the communities of Lynn and Malden regarding equity. So just wanted to give some very quick thank yous to the supporters and those who contributed to that, the Barr Foundation, the Sasaki Foundation, some students, Gabriela Sanders and Jari Prashasarta, as well as Annie Hudson also for helping us with that. So before we go any farther, I just wanted to mention very briefly that MIT has championed equity as being really an integral part of sustainable transportation for decades. This is not a new concept that we're just suddenly rediscovering. This figure, in fact, is one that comes from Joe Sussman, one of the late great transportation researchers from MIT, from 2006. And Professor Sussman's mnemonic was really that truly sustainable transportation was 3 E's. It's really easy to remember. It's environmental sustainability, it's economic sustainability, and it's equity or social sustainability. So as we talk about equity, I think that the words that I'd like to use come from Enrique Peñalosa, who's the former mayor of Bogota, and he really just described the challenge around mobility equity in a very effective way, I thought. He said that road space is one of the most valuable resources a city has. San Francisco could find oil or diamonds underground and it would not be as valuable. The question is how to distribute this road space between pedestrians, bicyclists, public transport, and cars, and obviously since then a lot more things as well. But he said there's no technical way of doing it. There's no legal way of doing it. And so equity really remains a thorny problem because equity is a product of legal and policy requirements that may not yet be adequately defined. And I would say basic protections like the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act have not been comprehensively applied to new mobility systems today. And so I'd encourage us as a group to consider how we can bring about changes in the policy space that embody the principle of inclusivity that John mentioned earlier and that we're really trying to hold up at MMI as being our North Star. So to talk a little bit more in detail about the event, the Equity Symposium panel started talking about accessibility, but what panelists quickly pivoted to was the topics of housing and community engagement as being really important. And we had four great panelists moderated by Andre Setfoot from MIT. So our first panelist, Whitney, added to the conversation the aspect of creating sustainable communities through access to healthcare, access to schools, access to employment, shared spaces, parks and recreation, which all really play a significant role in the prosperity of communities. And Whitney really emphasized the importance of incentivizing participation in community meetings and community engagement. You can't just put a posting out for a meeting looking to solicit input for the future of transportation and expect that people will show up. These people have other obligations. In many cases, simple things like providing food or scheduling a variety of different times when community members can come to participate in these meetings can be really important to getting community engagement and buy-in. So one of our other panelists, Aaron Clausen, principal planner at the City of Lynn, pointed out that as planners and community builders, that locating opportunities is an important task to connecting communities and making them more accessible for everyone. So one of the things that Aaron pointed out was that a city like Lynn is often really viewed as being a bedroom community, but more than half the trips that take place in a community like Lynn still, they start in Lynn and they end in Lynn. So despite the fact this view of being a bedroom community, local transportation really is important. And what this means is that while issues like improving service quality in commuter rail or improving bus headways might be viewed as kind of a sexy topic associated with this community, in reality, it's some more fundamental things, like making sure that communities have good biking infrastructure, that the sidewalks are in good repair, can be more important for more than half of the trips. So Andres brought up one of the additional challenges associated with bringing the accessibility to a community, that improved service can be viewed as an unambiguously positive thing on its face, but it can overlook small problems or large problems that improved service quality might actually create. So the renter community, for example, provided input simply saying that they were concerned about rising home values, and providing additional accessibility to a community like Lynn would be great for the homeowners, but for the renters that might be priced out, that creates a lot of new issues around displacement. But I think finally that Wendell Joseph from the Sasaki Foundation really said it best when we're talking about transportation systems and equity. These could be really guiding words for us here at the Mobility Initiative. Mobility is a complex and dynamic phenomenon. It's a unique experience that varies widely from one neighborhood to the next and one person to another. And one of the reasons why ongoing community engagement is going to be a part of any mobility initiative. So our second panel at the Mobility and Equity Symposium focused on COVID's impact on transportation. And it looks like my picture of Jim Aloisi didn't appear here. But what Jim said was really there were three important framing questions around mobility and COVID. So the first question was simply that there's a great danger. There's a great danger before us that we're going to repeat the mistakes of the 20th century by using new technologies to separate and segregate people rather than to improve things, that we could actually exacerbate existing problems. One of the other points that Jim raised was simply whether a return to normalcy meant a return to the status quo, the inadequate status quo pre-COVID. And then finally, to encourage us to think whether there's a sustainability response to COVID that can redirect policies, urban design, and limited financial resources in a way that will be more sustainable. Again, photo issues here. So the panel members conveyed that the sense of this trough of public transportation, this drop-off that I'm sure we're all familiar with, of the use of public transportation during COVID, really had overlooked some really important nuance. So one point that they brought up, and this was consistent feedback from residents of Lynn and Malden, that the bus service had always been inadequate pre-COVID. And Jonathan Feinberg from the New Lynn Coalition described his bus commute, and I think many of us can probably relate to this. I would wait at an uncovered bus station on an unfinished sidewalk where there used to be a train track for a bus that was completely full, that was 20 minutes late, with another almost completely full bus immediately behind it, right? So obviously some existing concerns around pre-COVID public transportation accessibility. But the panel also pointed out that there was a high correlation between the residences of essential workers and areas where there was sustained ongoing public transit ridership during the pandemic, right? So despite the fact that there was a trough of ridership, the people that did continue to use public transportation were in many cases those essential workers who were trying to preserve transportation for during the pandemic. And then finally, the pandemic-related solutions have sometimes been counterintuitive. So Steve Winslow at the City of Malden lauded the MBTA for increasing service to Malden during the pandemic. And he pointed out that a lot of people were asking him why the buses were empty. Why was the MBTA continuing to run buses that were empty during the pandemic? But that was exactly the point, that those half-empty buses were exactly what gave riders the confidence to step on those buses despite the fact that there was an ongoing pandemic. So I also wanted to offer a couple of personal insights regarding the Slow Streets movement. How many of you are familiar with the Slow Streets movement during COVID? Okay, so quite a few of you. I guess I'm in the right crowd here. So the Slow Streets movement, for those of you who don't know, was essentially a movement to take back some of the streets, some of the space that had been allocated to private cars for decades prior to the pandemic. There was really an opportunity to use that space for new purposes like dining or like physical distancing space for people to exercise during the pandemic. And I initially was one of those that was really cheering on these efforts to transform our cities and to transform them quickly during a moment of opportunity. And I thought I was in good company among people that thought that this was unambiguously a good thing. But I read these two articles, and in fact, I would encourage you to read these articles. One was by Alyssa Walker on Curbed, and the other was by Ariel Ward, both around May of 2020 last year. And they were both pushing back against these slow streets movements, and they're pushing back on equity grounds. And the two of them really brought up, I thought, two very important points. So first, again, if we didn't hit it enough during the symposium, I'll say it again, community engagement really matters, as does process. So while the pandemic had created these urgent needs to transform our physical space, the rush to respond with the slow streets movement sometimes came at the expense of stakeholder input. And historically speaking, rushed decisions and lack of community input have often caused enormous harms to vulnerable communities. So that was my first takeaway from these two pieces. My second takeaway from these two pieces is that while our focus today is on mobility, disadvantaged communities are beset by many problems: racial violence, gender violence, lack of education, healthcare. And this rush to fix a problem of slow streets, or with slow streets, was really viewed by many as just a priority that was inconsistent with the needs of the community, that we had all these other problems that needed to be solved first. So I'd just like to offer one final thought here. And of course, now you see it, and my other picture here is, is now you don't. So at the outset of the event today, Jinhua encouraged us to think about mobility solutions that don't exist today, but could exist in the future. So with this in mind, I wanted to share a couple of images from the Boston Globe in the 1980s. So at the time, Boston was in the early stages of what would be eventually become a 2-decade, $24 billion transportation project. Everybody know what it is?
Big dig.
Okay, all right. Not a lot of projects fall into that magnitude of time and money. But the Central Artery Tunnel really tried to address what I thought was a trifecta of unsustainability, right? It was an environmental problem. The Central Artery was an environmental problem. It was estimated to cause $500 million every year in social damage. And this was primarily borne by the community in the form of environmental damage and loss of life through high crash rate. It caused economic problems. So it was the wasted time of Boston community members. The Central Artery was, at its peak, congested between 10 and 12 hours a day. Imagine that at a standstill, gridlock, 12 hours a day. And it essentially was causing late workers and late deliveries. But the Central Artery had also created enormous equity problems. It had cut off the North End and cut off the waterfront district and other neighborhoods of the city, really a microcosm of the equity problems that our highway system had caused throughout the United States and communities. So Fred Salvucci and other leaders of the Big Dig recognized that the schedule and the cost of the Big Dig would be really hard for Boston residents to stomach. It would really test people's patience during this long and painful transition. And using the most sophisticated models and the best means of communication available, that was cardboard models and the Boston Globe Sunday edition, the Big Dig leaders kept the focus on the future, although their vision was still more than a decade away from reality. So in fact, this was the now you see it image. The now you don't image was run a week later, and the now you don't was a cardboard model showing the Rose Kennedy Greenway, what would ultimately become one of the most beautiful park areas in Boston. So it asked that we maintain the same level of tenacity that Fred Salvucci did and the other visionaries behind the Big Dig. We grit our teeth, we keep our focus on safe, clean, and inclusive mobility in the future. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Stephen.